Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Um, the GET team has established this webinar series some time ago, but well, I'm afraid to say we've let it lapse for a while. But we use this to, well, present you our newest research outcomes and to comment on topical developments. So you can always find out about our webinar series by visiting our website, which is get-project.de. Or you can also subscribe to our newsletter or watch our Twitter feed. Now, today we are going to talk about boosting trade in the digitalization era. This is a study that we have done together with ESIPE and which we have published last autumn. And I'm very glad that today Eric van der Marel and Philip Lamprecht, one of the authors of this study, are going to join us today and are going to give us a greater insight into what they have found out. First of all, let me give you a quick introduction though. Why does trade in digital services actually matter? After that, I'm going to give the floor to the two authors who are going to give us a more in-depth view of the potential and actual trade in digital services and which factors play a role that a country really captures its potential in this important area. After the presentation from the authors, we'll have a short Q&A. At all points, you can pose your questions by using the little menu you have on your screen. There's a section called Question. You can just enter your question there, and we'll get to that question after the presentation and answer it in the Q&A. Now, a question that I was asked quite a lot when we were about to publish this study, what exactly is a digital service? Well, I could take a shortcut and say basically this webinar is a digital service. A digital service is basically any kind of service that is delivered using intensively information technology. Last night, I spent quite a lot of time booking my summer holidays. And of course, I relied on websites of travel agencies, airlines, and so on to do that. So that would be an example for a quite strongly digital intensive service. What we have done in this study is that we have identified which sectors are particularly digitally intensive. So let me just give you a few examples with which kind of sectors these are. Well, telecommunications would be one example, and not a very surprising one. Computer programming is not much of a surprise either, along with publishing activities, business services, travel agencies, also for administrations and support services, legal and accounting, management consulting. Here you already have quite a few. So why does digital services and trade in digital service matter? Well, we know that services are actually already quite important for most economies. For a country like Germany, which traditionally has a quite strong manufacturing sector, 69% of the value added in GDP is generated in the services sector. This figure is actually pretty close to the OECD average, although we know that some economies such as France and the UK actually have a larger services share than the OECD average. So services are important. But if you look at the chart, which you see at the left on the left of my screen, you see that, well, the bars represent trading good. And you see that the growth rates which are represented here are actually in decline. For services, you see that that is somewhat better, but still not revolutionary. That's the solid dark blue line. But the yellow line is a different story. And that is the story that trade in digital services tells us. So we know that services are important, services are increasingly digital, and digital services are a growth market, and so is trade in digital services. So this tells us that this is actually a very important subject, and it's worthwhile to understand which countries are actually using their potential in this growth sector, and which factors enable countries to reap their potential or to fall beneath it. And that is precisely the question that Eric and Philip are going to answer in their presentations. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Eric, who is going to continue the presentation.
Yes, hi. This is Eric speaking. We are going to start our slides presentation, in which we are going to tell you the main conclusions of the study. And as you can see, I mean, the study itself is called Boosting Trade in Services in the Digital Era. The basic question that was we were trying to answer was, what is it that we see in European Union countries, but also countries outside the European Union? Which countries are doing well in trading digital services, and which countries are doing not so well? And the second question then we are trying to answer is, why is this the case, basically? Now, there are various ways in which you can actually answer the first question, but a particular way of answering is through using specific models that we use in the international trade literature. And one of those models is the gravity model. Why are we using that? Well, because that is something that you can see in the next slide. And this is basically the story where it is all about. You can actually estimate with the gravity model which countries are trading according to expectation and which countries are trading not so well according to expectations. And these expectations are based on economic fundamentals. So in other words, this model tries to assess where a country should actually be trading. And this should be trading is precisely what we call the potential of a country's capabilities to trade something. And in our case, this is a digital services trade. Now, and that is summarized here in this graph. So if you look at this graph, you see on the vertical axis the actual trade of a particular dot, and a dot is representing a country. Whereas on the horizontal line, you'll see the potential of a country's digital trade exports. Now, if a country is above this blue line, you'll see that the country is then trading more than its potential. So more than it's expected and more than it should be. Although should be is here, of course, a bit of a value judgment, but let's say that this is then potential. And so if a country is below the blue line, you'll see that it is trading below its potential. Now, if you take a close look to this graph, you see that, I mean, all the country dots are scattered around the blue line. So what a country should trade is what it in fact, in reality, is actually trading. So countries are overall, in line with the expectations. However, there are some deviations from these lines. I mean, and one of the most important takeaways or conclusions or results from this graph, which are important for our study, is that both Germany and France, which are the biggest markets inside the European Union, are actually what we call then under trading. And so what they show here is that they are placed below this blue line. And so they're trading below their potential. In more detail is the next slide, where we set out for all these countries a ranking of who underperforms and who overperforms, or who undertrades and who overtrades. And so here you can clearly see that some countries are doing very well and they're put in red, and some countries are not so doing well, or they are trading below their potential in terms of digital services trade. Now, the interesting takeaway here is that, again, Germany and France are very often placed in the box of underperformers, so in blue. But the second takeaway is that actually only a small share or a minority of all the countries that we have analyzed in the European Union and beyond, but this table only shows you European Union countries, only a minority of these countries are actually overperforming. So the sort of takeaway there is that it's actually not only Germany and France that are underperforming, but many more other countries. In other words, or we can also put it differently, there is still huge scope for many European countries to trade digital services and to export digital services. So basically, a lot of these countries are, sort of below their potential, what they actually can export in terms of digital services trade. And this is important because we are entering a digital era. We are digitalizing very rapidly, at least the global economy is, specifically developed countries like European Union countries. And so there is still enormous potential or scope to be reached, or untapped potential to be filled in order to export these digital services. Now, you might wonder, I mean, why is this the case? So that was the second question, right? So why is it that some countries are underperforming? That's the most important part. And so benchmark against those countries that are overperforming. Now, you can say that is because of services policy. Well, that is something that we have thrown into the model. So that is incorporated, this kind of factor of services policies, like all the regulatory policies that make it that the services become tradable. So what is left is something else, and this something else deserves special attention because this something else is what we call enabling factors. Enabling factors in the sense that how is a country's digital infrastructure organized, or how does domestic businesses take up digital tools and ICT, and how do consumers take up digital tools and ICT. So that is something that we have also analyzed with what we call so-called frontier analysis. And so the next couple of slides will show you the results of this frontier analysis. So in order to do so, we have taken an indicator from the World Economic Forum that shows the extent to which all countries that they have taken up, basically the majority of all countries in the world, do perform on some of these ICT indicators, whether they are highly ranked or low ranked. And so we take all these indicators together and group them in a specific category and try to find out where Germany is placed, but moreover, where Germany is placed vis-a-vis the leading country within a particular group, like the European Union or the OECD, and how does Germany compare with other non-developed countries such as the BRICS, because that gives us additional information. Now here, this graph that shows, or what you see here in front of you, is showing sort of the head category of such an indicator that takes some of these sub-indicators or factors that is composing this overall index into account. So this gives you just a rough picture of what's going on. Now, if you see the orange line, which represents Germany, you will quickly see that in the right side of this graph, I mean, if you take the space from 0 to 100 into account, where 100 represents the frontier, so the more upward placed you are on these factors, the better you are performing, and the closer you are to the frontier, so you're basically in the leading basket of countries. Now, on the right-hand side of this graph, you'll see that on some of these factors, Germany is doing well, but on the other hand, on the left side, you see that on some of these sort of aggregate indicators, Germany is not so performing well, in the sense that there is still a gap between the orange line and the blue line or the gold line, which is the frontier country within the EU and the OECD, respectively. So again, I mean, this is just an overall picture, and so you can focus more specifically on some of the additional sub-indicators to find out where exactly in this sort of digital network space Germany is furthermore performing relatively well or performing relatively worse. Now, one of such sub-indicators is just basic infrastructure. You know, how are the telecommunication market organized? How are these telecommunication firms? Are they still like dominating in the market or not? And here you see some of these factors And you'll see here that on a substantial amount of indicators regarding infrastructure, the orange line leaves a huge gap compared to the frontier, which means that Germany is still having a large gap and is not, and in this particular case, at all performing to the best performer that across the whole world is showing, and that is a country within the OECD. Now, an additional side that is important to look at is to who are actually using digital tools and ICT. Because what is important in terms of economics is that all these digital tools and ICT need eventually be absorbed by everybody in order to make our economy more productive. And so you can look at the consumer side and you can look at the producer side, because that really facilitates economic growth and therefore also trade, and in particular digital services trade. Well, if you see at this graph for the consumer, you can quickly see that, well, Germany is actually not so performing very bad. I mean, you can see that it is pretty much close to the leading frontier economy, pretty close to the number 100, and pretty close upward placed to the top level of this chart. So here the gap between the leading firm and Germany is not so big. So on the consumer side, it is doing pretty okay. Whereas on the business side, the extent to which businesses are absorbing all these ICT and digital tools, that's where we see in our paper where the gap is actually substantial between Germany and the leading country, or the country that is at the frontier of actually absorbing ICT and digital tools. So what do you need to think of then? Well, for example, the extent to which German firms are using cloud computing, whether they use ICT in order to manage their teams, whether they are actually basically using websites for selling services and goods. And so there we see that Germany is actually sort of lagging behind many of the frontier countries. Okay, so to wrap up, I mean, what we have done so far is to look at digital services trade and the extent to which, you know, that can be explained in terms of overperformance and underperformance, sort of in a sense of exporting a service directly across a border, so directly over the internet. But, I mean, the recent international trade literature also have put forward the notion of indirect trade compared to direct trade. And economists have found this out in terms of the value added of a good or a service that is exported directly across borders or indirectly across borders. And indirectly across borders means that it is integrated into a good or another service. And so that is important because many services are actually used as inputs in goods and other services. And so the indirect aspect of services really comes out there. And B, actually by analyzing this indirect share of services, we have found out that the aspect of services in the economy even becomes more and more important. Now, what do we see here? I mean, the basic question there is, okay, if we know that, and we would like to narrow down the performance of direct and indirect trade for digital services trade, where is Germany performing there then? And here we see that Germany, again, is, together with France, underperforming because in this bar, or in this bar chart, these two countries are placed below the red line, which is the average level of OECD countries. And so you see here that the direct share is given in blue, whereas the indirect share is given in gold or yellow. And there on both sides, I mean, Germany as well as France are, again, underperforming. The next slide focuses deeper on the indirect part of digital services trade, or value added of trade in gross exports. And there, I mean, you see that Germany is just below the red line. And so, yeah, also regarding the indirect share of anything that Germany is exporting in terms of, you know, the value added that is integrated into another good and in turn exported supported there as well. There is still scope for Germany to increase that level. Okay, so that's it for me. And now, I mean, Philip will take over for the rest of the presentation about some of the aspects deeper into Germany itself.
Thank you very much, Eric. So my name is Philip Lamprecht, and I'm one of the co-authors of the study together with Eric. And thanks, Eric, for this introduction of the basic landscape and what we are going to analyze. And I will now start off the second part of our presentation, which focuses more on what policy needs to do. And in order to do so, I will firstly develop the analysis a bit more with regard to productivity in order to analyze where the problems lie, so that we can identify where policy should engage and what policy should do. So productivity, which we measure by a proxy defined as output per worker, is a good first indication of the potential of the sector to trade and also of the general competitiveness of the sector in question. So it is a good indicator for us to analyze what is behind the developments of trade underperformance or overperformance, and it gives a good proxy for analysis, outlining whether sectors are competitive and capable of trading. Now that we have talked so much about whether certain countries are over or underperforming in this trade. Here, our first point is that we can observe differences in productivity levels on the national level of Germany between sectors. So I'm now focusing on the case of Germany with regard to policy intervention. And first observation, differences on the national level between sectors. And the second observation is that there are, because we did also go into the regional level with regard to the case of Germany, the second observation is that there are differences in the levels of productivity across German regions for individual sectors. So this slide shows the first observation. This is the national level. Here we see that, for example, business services, financial services, telecommunications, so classically digital intense services sectors are actually quite productive in Germany, whereas other digital intense service sectors like corporate consultancy services, legal services, other professional services, advertising, market research are less productive. And here it's important to note that these less productive services are still very important for businesses to perform their operations in order to trade, and they are also important for non-digital sectors such as manufacturing. And I will come back to this now with regard to the regional level. So this slide shows our regional analysis, which we performed for a number of different sectors in Germany. And because we do not have time to go through the entire regional analysis that we performed, I'm just choosing as an example productivity in administrative and support service activities. The dots are the overall level of productivity, and the yellow bars are regions in former East Germany, and the blue bars are regions in former West Germany. So we see that from different levels, which are the dots, the dark blue dots, there has been certain growth which is positive or negative. And if we look, for example, at North Rhine-Westphalia, which is a traditional powerhouse of German manufacturing, and also Bavaria, which, for example, as a region, also is a powerhouse of manufacturing, we see that with regard to administrative and support service activities, they are not very productive, and in the case of Bavaria, even quite unproductive with regard to their productivity growth. This shows that in certain regions in Germany where manufacturing classically is very dominant and very strong, certain support services necessary for these firms to perform their tasks, to be competitive, to trade, are actually quite unproductive. And this shows a need for policy intervention. So policy should be directed at those sectors in Germany that show low levels of productivity growth, let alone maybe even negative levels of productivity growth, and try to increase these productivity levels. Now, the question is, of course, how to best do that. And Eric outlined a number of so-called digital endowments, such as infrastructure elements and also to a certain extent usage or capability in the population, so digital capacity. And these are all very important factors, but we found that one important element where policy should focus on is actually increasing the incentives and removing the obstacles for firms in Germany to make use of these digital endowments. So that the important focus should actually be that policy tries to incentivize and remove obstacles that firms face and to make firms use the endowments that we have outlined in the first part of our presentation more. So in using them will make them more competitive and will enable them to trade more. And this is also important for the so-called process of digital business transformation. So we have all heard processes such as Industry 4.0 or in general digitalization, and importance for digital industry is increasing in general, that our whole employment structure will be changed by so-called digital disruption. Many jobs might disappear. And one can imagine that this is a very difficult environment for companies, let alone small startups or SMEs. So many companies have to face so-called digital disruption on a continuous basis, and they have to adapt in order to survive or even to grow. And the usage of such digital endowments and digital service, intense digital services sectors is also important for firms to obtain a so-called digital ability and to face and survive this process of digital business transformation. And I'm now just going to go over some basic indicators that illustrate absorption or usage of these digital indicators that show how much companies use digital intense services. And here we see, for example, that Germany is below average when it comes to digital intensity. The red line is the average line, and Germany is just below. Another interesting indicator is enterprises exchanging business documents for automatic processing. Again, German companies are below the average, below the red line. And here we see even enterprises analyzing big data, where Germany is almost last in an international comparison. So we see that one often thinks of Germany as a big trading bloc in the European Union, but with regard to this level of usage, German companies actually lag behind. And to sum up, both Eric's section and my section, it becomes apparent that gross digital services trade over the internet in large countries such as Germany and France does not live up to its potential. And Germany performs poorly when it comes to digital infrastructural issues. And more importantly, however, as I outlined in my section, Germany's businesses appear to be reluctant to embrace the tools at their hands, such as processes and procedures or even digital management practices. And one important focus for policy should be exactly to improve business usage of these endowments and to create incentives and remove obstacles, which will help German companies also in non-digital sectors, such as manufacturing sometimes, to overcome and perform well in the process of digital business transformation. Thank you very much. This is the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Eric and Philip, for this insightful presentation. We now come to the Q&A. As I've said, you can ask questions by using the questions section in your drop-down menu on the right of the screen. Let's kick off with one question that we've received already. How do you think that, I mean, we've talked a lot about Germany and Germany's difficulties with keeping up with the pace of digitalization that we see in some other countries. How are the propositions of the new government in terms of digitalization going to help in this regard? Can you say anything about that?
Yes, we can. We have included in our study a full screening of the entire landscape of recent and current policy initiatives in Germany and by the German government. And we looked at them thoroughly. If you consult our study, you can see that one section is based only on the analysis of German policies at the moment and for the past years. And also we've included an overview table at the end of our study. And the result that we found when screening these policies is that they are very well suited to address issues with regard to digital endowments, also including digital capacity in the population. So yes, with regard to infrastructure and capacity, abilities in the population, all these policies exactly aim at the right spots. But what we were missing a little bit is specific initiatives aiming at exactly what we pointed out, which is incentivizing and removing obstacles for companies, which is businesses, not persons in the population. So the private sector companies to increase their usage of these endowments. Here, we did not find major specific policy initiatives aimed exactly at businesses. And this is what we would like to point out. Policymakers should not forget about companies which depend on profitability and are currently in the context of digital disruption on a monthly basis.
Thank you. We have another question that deals exactly with the business side. The question is, what are the implications of service provision through online platforms on businesses in general, but also in particularly on small and medium enterprises?
So if I understand your question well, so what do the platforms have as an effect on enterprises and the export of enterprises, and in particular the SMEs?
Yes, that's the question. Yeah.
Okay, so no, I mean, from an economist point of view, these kind of platforms, they should lower any trading costs for firms. And the beauty of these kind of platforms is that they substantially should lower trading costs for small and medium-sized firms. I mean, trading doesn't fall from the sky, so one needs to, set up a network. One needs to find clients abroad in order for their goods and services to be exported. Now, for services, I mean, it should be a little bit easier because things can be traded over the internet. But with the use of platforms, this might actually be a lot easier. Now, because it makes use of the internet and it tries to connect consumers and producers through this platform. So in principle, I mean, it should make it easier and therefore by lowering these trade costs. Now, the interesting element of platforms itself is that the platform is, of course, also a service. And so if you take that into account, I mean, this whole digital innovation of platforms has opened a new type of services as well, on which some of these countries that produce these platforms are actually capitalizing on. So,
right. Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. So unless we are not getting some questions soon from another participant, I think all that remains for me to do is to thank our two experts who have joined us and to give us a very interesting insight in the study that they have done. I'd like to thank you, our participants, for your interest in our study, and I hope to welcome you again soon for one of our next webinars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.